In the decades following the Civil War, America became a nation enthralled by the promise of progress. Railroads bound the continent together, cities swelled with industry, and the state, newly confident in its power, sought to impose order on the fringes of society. Among those fringes were the men and women judged to be insane. For centuries, the mad had been hidden away in attics, chained in poorhouses, or left to wander the streets. Now, reformers promised a new vision: vast institutions where science and morality would combine to cure minds broken by grief, vice, or heredity. Massachusetts, proud of its intellectual heritage, was among the first to embrace the movement. The state built asylums like cathedrals of reason, sprawling brick complexes set upon wind-swept hills. Their architects designed them according to the Kirkbride plan, with long, staggered wings extending like arms from a central dome, each corridor meant to catch light and air, each ward organized by severity. Brochures described them as sanctuaries of mercy, where the afflicted would find not punishment but restoration. Families delivered their troubled kin with trembling hope, convinced that inside those walls doctors possessed methods unknown to the world beyond. Yet, the reality was harsher. By 1886, Northampton, Danvers, and Worcester State Hospitals were no longer temples of healing, but warehouses of the unwanted. Originally constructed for a few hundred, they held thousands. Men and women slept three to a bed or lay on straw across stone floors. Treatments promised by reformers rest, moral instruction, gentle labor gave way to restraints, ice baths, and isolation cells. The state called them wards of care. Patients called them the black wards. It was in these hidden corridors that the great silence began. Visitors who arrived with fruit baskets and letters were told their loved ones could not be seen that day. A month later, a curt note arrived. Their relative had passed quietly in the night. There was no funeral, no grave they could visit, only a line in a ledger and the assurances of an overworked superintendent. The explanations were always the same: fever, consumption, sudden collapse, but no bodies were shown, and no questions were answered. What is left to us are fragments, letters smuggled by patients, notes in fading ink from nurses who dared to speak of shortages, whispers preserved in local newspapers that dared not print the word starvation. Behind the iron gates and red brick facades, Massachusetts had constructed not sanctuaries but labyrinths where men and women vanished as though devoured by the buildings themselves. Reform had promised light and healing, yet by the twilight of the 19th century, the wards had grown darker than anyone outside dared imagine. Northampton State Hospital rose from the green hills of western Massachusetts in 1856, a fortress of red brick and ambition. It was built according to the Kirkbride design, that celebrated architectural philosophy which held that the very shape of a building could heal broken minds. Its wings spread outward like the ribs of a great skeleton, each staggered corridor angled to capture sunlight and fresh air, each hall wide enough to accommodate long walks meant to soothe restless nerves. At its dedication, reformers hailed the hospital as a triumph of enlightened care, a place where the mad would be restored to dignity through routine, labor, and the benevolence of science. Its capacity was set at 200 patients, a number deemed sufficient to ensure quiet, order, and the personal attention of physicians who believed themselves pioneers of moral treatment. 3 decades later, the vision had curdled into nightmare. By 1886, Northampton no longer held 200 souls but more than 1,000, crammed into every ward, every corridor, every space that could bear a bed or a straw mat. Men and women who were meant to find solace in sunlight now sat in darkness, packed 3 to a room, or stretched on the floors of damp basements. The very design that was intended to heal became a cage, a labyrinth of desperation where voices echoed endlessly, and sanity unraveled further in the din. The ward smelled of mildew, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of overcooked gruel. Funding lagged far behind the swelling population. The state, proud to parade its institutions as monuments of progress, balked at the cost of sustaining them. Physicians begged for more attendants, for better provisions, for medicines, but the legislature responded with paltry budgets and empty promises. As numbers grew, treatments devolved into restraints, isolation, and crude experimentation. Patients were plunged into ice baths until their skin turned blue, shackled in canvas straitjackets until they collapsed from exhaustion, or confined to dark, airless cells where silence was enforced not by therapy but by starvation of the senses. To the public, Northampton remained a symbol of Massachusetts' commitment to mental health. The grounds, manicured at the front, suggested order and civility. Families who visited on appointed days were shown parlors where a few well-groomed patients sat reading or sewing, carefully chosen to reassure the visitor that their loved ones were in capable hands. Yet behind the locked doors of Ward C, Ward D, and the overflow wings hastily added without architectural grace, another reality seethed patients forgotten, beaten into obedience, or left to rock endlessly on iron cots. What began as a sanctuary had become a warehouse, a place where the unwanted were hidden away from society's gaze. Northampton was not alone in this decline. Every state asylum bore the same scars, but here, in the hills of Massachusetts, the scale was immense, and the silence surrounding it even greater. It was in this crucible of neglect and overpopulation that the darker rumors began to surface, whispers that food was scarce, that hunger gnawed at the wards, and that in the desperation of Northampton, meals were not always what they seemed. The first whispers of hunger at Northampton did not come from official reports or the lips of physicians. They came from scraps of paper, smuggled beneath collars, hidden in hems, or slipped into the hands of visitors who dared to look closely at the trembling figures on the other side of iron bars. These letters, written in broken script and often stained with tears, carried a single refrain: there was never enough to eat. Patients spoke of thin soup, a watery broth so clear that the bottom of the bowl could be seen through it. They wrote of bread so hard it bruised the gums, loaves baked from coarse flour that turned to stone within a day. Meat, when it appeared, was stringy and riddled with gristle, unfit even for the dogs that prowled the asylum yard. Families who received these letters, folded tightly and carried at great risk, brought their concerns to the administrators. They were told the complaints were the ravings of diseased minds, that hunger was a delusion common among the insane. Doctors dismissed the testimonies as hysteria, claiming their charges were well-fed and prone to exaggeration. Official menus were produced, neat lists of nutritious stews and fresh-baked breads that satisfied the visiting committees and reassured legislators in Boston. On paper, Northampton's kitchens appeared models of sufficiency. Yet those who lived within the wards knew a different truth, one measured in gnawing stomachs and the nightly dreams of food that never arrived. Overcrowding strained the kitchen beyond any intention of its design. For more than 1,000 mouths, provisions purchased for half that number were stretched thin. Servants in the kitchen were seen watering down broth until it lost all taste, slicing loaves into slivers, grinding scraps into paste to disguise their scarcity. Yet, curiously, not every ward suffered the same. Those confined to Ward C and other locked sections complained most bitterly, while certain privileged patients in the convalescent wards seemed to receive better fare, thicker stew, softer bread, even meat with discernible muscle. The difference did not go unnoticed. Patients muttered to one another across barred doors that food was not the same from ward to ward. Some claimed they recognized tastes that were wrong, textures unfamiliar, meat that was not like pork or beef but sweeter, softer, something they could not name without recoiling. Rumors spread like fever that those who vanished from the rolls of Northampton had not been buried at all, but consumed in silence by those too weak to question their meals. Staff silenced such talk as delusion, yet the whispers grew, carried in every letter, until families began to suspect the institution itself had developed an appetite of its own. Ward C was the place no one spoke of openly, even within the hospital itself. Situated at the far end of Northampton's eastern wing, it was walled off from the rest of the asylum by double doors reinforced with iron straps. To reach it, an attendant had to pass through two separate sets of keys and a narrow passage designed less for comfort than containment. The windows of the ward were narrow slits barred with rusting iron, admitting only a thin shaft of daylight during the brief hours when the sun fell at the proper angle. The air there smelled perpetually of disinfectant, sweat, and the faint, sour odor of bodies left too long unwashed. Ward C was reserved for those deemed violent, uncooperative, or irredeemable. Men and women who had resisted restraints, who shouted at invisible companions, who tore at their own flesh when left unguarded. Once placed there, few ever returned to the general population. It was a place of silence broken only by screams, a limbo where patients were locked in cells with little more than straw mattresses and iron rings fixed to the walls. Guards patrolled constantly, heavy truncheons hanging from their belts, the sound of their boots striking the floors, a reminder of authority in a place where human dignity had long been forgotten. And yet, it was the food that unsettled the few who paid close attention. Carts trundled down the long corridor each evening, pushed by attendants with bowed backs, the wooden wheels squealing under the weight of iron pots, and trays heaped high. More than once, nurses in adjoining wards remarked that the deliveries to Ward C seemed heavier than those for all the other wings combined. The rations accounted for in the hospital's books could not explain the size of those carts, the number of pots, the effort it took to roll them through the narrow hallways. And yet, the patients inside remained gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their bones pressing through thin gray gowns. Whispers carried beyond the bar's pleas for food, for bread that was more than crusts, for meat that was not rancid. Some said the meals arrived full, but the bowls served to the patients were nearly empty, their contents ladled away before reaching them. Others spoke of stews with odd flavors, meat that left a metallic taste on the tongue, meals that seemed designed to weaken rather than nourish. Guards dismissed these complaints with laughter, claiming the insane were too deluded to tell one meal from another. But the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Heavy carts rolled in each night, yet starvation hollowed the eyes of every soul in Ward C. In time, rumors began to circle even among the staff. Where did all that food go? And what exactly was inside those iron pots that disappeared behind the locked doors, never to be inspected once the lids were lifted? It was in the summer of 1886 that families began to notice the silences. A mother would arrive with a basket of fruit and a shawl knitted for the coming winter, only to be greeted at the gate by an attendant whose eyes slid away from hers. Her son, she was told, had passed quietly in the night. No illness had been reported in their last letter, no warning given, no request that she come at once to say goodbye. When she asked to see him, the attendant shook his head. The body had already been interred, a simple burial on the hospital grounds. It was policy, he explained. The family would be spared the distress of transport, and the institution spared the expense. She was shown the ledger, a neat line with her son's name beside the word deceased, and then ushered away. Other families reported the same. Fathers seeking daughters, brothers seeking brothers, wives arriving in carriages drawn across miles of rough road. The answers were always rehearsed. The patient had died suddenly, in peace, the body already laid to rest in the asylum cemetery. When pressed, officials claimed the graves were unmarked to maintain dignity, that records were kept in files families were not permitted to view. No autopsy reports were ever provided. No undertaker recalled handling the remains. On the hillside behind the hospital, there was indeed a small burying ground, rows of wooden crosses planted in the earth. Yet the soil there was curiously undisturbed, the number of graves far fewer than the names crossed off in the ledgers. Visitors who wandered too close to the fences noted weeds grown high, markers tilted or rotted away, and ground that bore no fresh signs of digging. If so many had died, where were they laid? And if buried elsewhere, why was no record made? In town, whispers grew. Shopkeepers spoke of carriages sent from Northampton under cover of night, covered wagons that rattled down empty roads and returned with no trace of their cargo. Some believed the patients were sold to medical schools, their bodies used for dissection. Others, darker still, claimed they were consumed within the asylum itself, their deaths erased as carefully as their lives had been confined. The hospital offered no answers. Letters went unanswered, inquiries dismissed, visiting committees shown only the sunlit wards where compliant patients sat in tidy rows. Behind the locked doors of Ward C and the unmarked graves on the hill, a different truth lingered, one that could not be spoken aloud. Families left in mourning carried with them not closure but a gnawing question. If the dead were buried, why could no one find the graves? And if they were not, then what had become of them? The most chilling account of Northampton's hidden practices surfaced decades later, in 1930, when a faded deposition was discovered among the probate papers of an attorney long since dead. It bore the name of Margaret Callahan, a nurse who had entered Northampton State Hospital as a young woman in 1884 and left 2 years later under circumstances she refused to speak of in her lifetime. Her testimony was given to a private investigator working on behalf of a family that suspected their daughter had not been buried at all but lost in some darker way. The document was never presented in court. It was sealed, stored, and forgotten until the box that contained it was opened 44 years later. Callahan's words tremble on the page, part confession, part warning. She writes of the endless nights she spent in Ward C, the locked wing where the most difficult patients were kept. The superintendent of that ward, a man she identifies only as Dr. Fisk, gave his instructions with a bluntness that left no room for questions. No waste, he told her, and repeated it whenever she hesitated at the sight of what the attendants carried down the hall. It was a command that governed everything in Ward C: food, clothing, even the remains of those who died in their cells. She recalled the kitchen stoves that burned at all hours, the heavy iron pots that steamed with odors she could not identify. At first, she thought it was simply spoiled meat, purchased cheap to stretch the hospital's meager budget. But the smell was different, sickly sweet, clinging to her clothes long after her shift ended. When she returned to her lodging house in town, her roommates wrinkled their noses and asked if she had been working in a tannery. She learned to walk home in silence, afraid of the questions she could not answer. More disturbing still were the patients themselves. After meals, many were too weak to rise from their benches, their limbs trembling as if the very act of swallowing had drained them. Callahan remembered one woman whose eyes grew glassy and vacant within minutes of finishing her bowl of stew, her body sliding to the floor as attendants dragged her back to her cell. It was not starvation that hollowed them, Callahan insisted, but something else, something in the food itself that dulled their strength and clouded their minds. She ended her deposition with a confession she claimed never left her lips while she lived. She had once lifted the lid of a pot in the Ward C kitchen. Inside, beneath the broth and bones, floated something she swore was a human hand, the nails pale and curling, the skin boiled loose from the knuckles. She shut the lid and said nothing, for she knew the meaning of Fisk's words: no waste. The kitchens of Northampton were never meant to be seen by visitors. Tucked in the basement beneath the main halls, they were a world apart, a hidden underbelly that sustained the sprawling institution above. The ceilings were low, the stone walls blackened with soot, the air thick with steam and the iron tang of boiled bone. Long before dawn, fires were lit under vast black cauldrons, and by the time patients were roused for the morning roll, the smell of stew already drifted through the vents. It was the heart of the asylum, a place where hunger was meant to be appeased. Yet in 1886, it became the stage for something else entirely. Attendants spoke of the machines with quiet unease. A heavy grinder, imported from Boston, stood bolted to one of the counters. It was meant for pork and beef, but its gears often jammed on bones too large for ordinary livestock. Butcher tables bore grooves worn deep from years of cleavers striking wood, and bloodstains seeped so far into the grain that no amount of scrubbing ever erased them. Barrels marked with chalk numbers lined the walls, filled with salt and brine for preserving cuts of meat. Beside them stood baskets of root vegetables, meager in comparison, suggesting that whatever stew was served to the wards owed its weight not to carrots or potatoes but to flesh. What drew suspicion most were the records. Inventories of pork deliveries carefully recorded each week revealed a curious arithmetic. For more than 1,000 patients, the hospital claimed only modest purchases, quantities far below what would have been required to sustain so many mouths. Yet somehow, the kitchens produced vats of stew in proportions that defied the math. Pots large enough to bathe in were ladled full twice daily, steaming and thick, carried on carts up through the wards. When the numbers were compared what was delivered versus what was consumed, there was no reconciling the gap. The food was appearing from somewhere, but not from any butcher in town. Rumors among the staff painted a grim picture. Carcasses were wheeled in on stretchers under sheets at night, bypassing the front gates entirely. Some attendants swore they saw the shapes of arms beneath the linen, stiff in death but destined not for burial. The phrase extra meat appeared in the ledgers with no explanation, a quiet euphemism that everyone pretended not to read. The taste of the stew was strange, some said, too sweet, with a texture that clung to the teeth. When families asked what their loved ones were being fed, the answer was always the same: pork stew, nourishing and plentiful. But those who worked in the kitchens, who saw the vats and the grinders and the butcher tables scarred by cleavers, whispered a different truth in the dark. There was no way the meager pork deliveries accounted for the food that left those cellars. The missing bodies, the vanished patients, and the endless stews all pointed to one conclusion too terrible to name. Whatever was being consumed in Northampton's kitchens, it was not entirely pork. Among the records that survived Northampton's long decline is the story of a man whose name was deliberately erased. His file bears only a number. His identity struck out as if his existence itself were an embarrassment to the hospital. But fragments of testimony, scrawled notes in the margins of ward reports, and a single letter from an attendant suggest his fate. He was remembered as the patient who would not eat. It began one evening in the late summer of 1886, when supper was brought to Ward C. The carts rattled down the corridor, pots of steaming stew ladled into bowls that clattered against the iron bars. Most patients, famished from days of meager rations, fell upon their portions with trembling hands. But this man froze. In the dim light he had seen something in his bowl that turned his stomach to stone. Lifting his spoon, he pushed aside the gristle and broth until it surfaced. Those who stood nearby later recalled his scream, a ragged cry that seemed to tear through the ward like a blade. In his shaking hand, he held what he swore was the tip of a human finger. The skin was pale and puckered, the nail still attached though softened by hours of boiling. He hurled the bowl across the floor, its contents splattering against the wall, and fell to his knees in horror. Over and over he shouted the same words: "It's people, they're feeding us people." The ward erupted in confusion. Some patients echoed his cries, others cowered in silence, and the guards rushed in swinging their clubs to restore order. For 3 days, he refused every meal placed before him. He screamed when attendants tried to force the spoon to his lips, vomited when broth was spilled near him, clawed at the walls of his cell until his fingers bled. He told anyone who would listen that the food was human flesh, that the missing patients had not been buried at all, but boiled down and ladled into bowls. His protests echoed through the corridors at night, a relentless chorus that unsettled even the hardened guards. The doctors labeled him delusional, his visions the product of a diseased mind. He was stripped, bound in a straitjacket, and carried to solitary confinement. The reports claim he wasted there, refusing sustenance until he was little more than a husk. The official cause of death reads starvation brought on by mania. Yet those who whispered about him long after the fact insisted that he had seen the truth with his own eyes, and that his screams were not madness but warning. In 1904, Long after Northampton State Hospital had expanded beyond its original design, a crew was sent to renovate one of the older basement wings. The walls were crumbling, the pipes leaking rust into the stone, and the state demanded improvements to reassure the public that their institutions remained respectable. It was during this demolition that workers pried loose a section of masonry behind the disused scullery. Within the hollow, they uncovered a tin strongbox, sealed with a corroded latch. Expecting money or valuables, they forced it open and found instead a small leather-bound ledger, its cover stiff with mildew, its pages browned with age. What they read inside unsettled even men accustomed to the grotesque. The book contained no names, only numbers, patient numbers, that corresponded to the hospital's own records. Each entry bore a date, followed by a brief notation. Many concluded with the phrase "rendered for use." The repetition was mechanical, devoid of sentiment, a phrase written in the same hand for page after page. Between 1885 and 1887, the ledger recorded more than 100 such entries. To the casual reader, it might have seemed bureaucratic shorthand, but to those familiar with the hospital's history, the meaning was plain. These were the missing patients, the ones families were told had died quietly in the night, buried without ceremony, and, rendered for use, suggested that their bodies had not been buried at all. The entries were precise. One patient's number marked with the note, "Rendered for use, 3 March, portions towards C." Another, "Rendered for use, 18 June, distributed." On occasion, the notation grew more specific. "Rendered for use, 12 September, marrow suitable." The clinical language reduced human lives to inventory, flesh measured as provision. No autopsy reports matched the dates. No graves were dug. The ledger stood as silent testimony to a practice so monstrous it defied belief that the hospital had processed its dead, reducing them to sustenance for the living. When the discovery was quietly reported to the superintendent, the ledger vanished. The workers were warned to speak of it to no one. Yet a few lines were copied onto scraps of paper before the book was removed, and those fragments survived in private collections until whispers of them surfaced decades later. The strongbox itself was never seen again. What endures is the memory of its pages, the neat, efficient script, the cold certainty of its phrases, rendered for use. It was not the language of medicine, nor of care. It was the language of a butcher. In those words, the asylum's hunger was made visible, a hunger fed not by pork or beef, but by the patients it claimed, one by one, and fed back to those who remained. Dr. Albert Fisk's name appears only sporadically in the official records of Northampton, as though even the institution itself wished to soften his presence. Born in 1831 to a modest family in Lowell, Massachusetts, Fisk studied medicine in Boston before the outbreak of the Civil War provided him with an opportunity that would shape both his skill and his temperament. He served as a surgeon with the Union Army, a man known for his speed with the knife. In the bloody fields of Antietam and Fredericksburg, when dozens of shattered bodies awaited on stretchers, Fisk became infamous for performing amputations without anesthetic, insisting there was no time to dull the pain when men were dying in rows. He spoke of efficiency, of necessity, of the expendability of flesh. Those who worked under him remembered the cries that filled the makeshift tents, and the way Fisk never flinched. When the war ended, he returned to civilian life carrying not only his surgical instruments, but a philosophy honed by years of battlefield triage. Lives could be weighed and measured, and some were worth less than others. By the 1870s, he found employment at Northampton, rising quickly to the position of superintendent of Ward C. Here he encountered a population he regarded with the same cold detachment as the wounded soldiers of his past. The insane, as he termed them, were less than men. They were mouths that consumed, bodies that flailed, burdens that sapped the resources of the state. His obsession with efficiency became policy. Fisk's ward ran with military precision. Meals were rationed to the ounce, labor scheduled by the hour, punishments meted out with mechanical regularity. Attendants were told to waste nothing, not even the dead. He regarded corpses as resources, material no different from the rations delivered to the kitchen. It was under his watch that the phrase "rendered for use" began to circulate among the staff, a euphemism he himself was said to employ with chilling casualness. Nurses whispered that he took personal interest in the kitchens, supervising the grinders and vats as though overseeing an operation more surgical than culinary. He was a tall man, gaunt, his eyes sunken but alert, his hair graying at the temples though his movements remained sharp. Patients feared him instinctively. He walked the wards with a cane that clicked against the floor, his gaze passing over the emaciated figures without recognition of their humanity. To him they were not souls but numbers, entries in ledgers, variables in the equation of asylum survival. Those who vanished under his care were explained away as casualties of madness. Yet the rumors persisted, whispered by staff who dared not speak above a murmur, that Fisk had turned Northampton into something more than a hospital, something closer to a slaughterhouse, where efficiency meant ensuring the dead continued to serve the living. At night, Northampton was alive with sounds that unsettled even the most hardened attendants. The long corridors echoed with groans, the occasional shriek from a cell, and the restless shuffle of patients who never slept deeply. Yet among these familiar disturbances, there was another noise that staff could not ignore, one that grew louder as the hours lengthened and the lamps guttered. It was the sound of chewing steady, insistent, a gnawing that came from within the very walls themselves. At first, attendants assumed it was rats. The old building, with its damp cellars and crumbling mortar, was a haven for vermin. Traps were set, poisons laid, but the noises never ceased. What troubled them most was where the sounds originated. Nurses reported hearing them not just in storerooms or basements, but behind the heavy iron doors of the meat lockers. These rooms, locked and bolted, were meant to contain the provisions of the hospital: barrels of salted pork, sides of beef when they were delivered, sacks of grain. Yet even when no deliveries had arrived, the chewing persisted. It seemed to come from within, as though something inside was devouring whatever lay stored there. One night, an attendant swore he heard not the sharp chatter of rats' teeth, but the tearing of larger jaws, the wet sound of marrow cracked open. He refused afterward to pass that hallway alone. Bones began to appear in odd places. In the ash pit beneath the kitchen stoves, fragments blackened by fire but not consumed. In corners of the scullery where refuse was swept, pale pieces gnawed so clean they gleamed in the lantern light. They were not the bones of animals too long, too delicate in structure. Several attendants, men who had butchered livestock on farms before coming to the hospital, whispered that they recognized them as human. One fragment, shaped unmistakably like a femur, was hidden quickly before questions could be asked. Another, smaller, had teeth marks along its length, marks far too narrow for rats. When staff raised their concerns, Dr. Fisk dismissed them with icy efficiency. He told them rats were inevitable in a building of such size, and that their imaginations were diseased by the very madness that surrounded them. Yet the chewing continued. At times, it seemed to grow louder when the carts from Ward C were returned to the kitchen empty, the pots scraped bare. Some swore that the sounds did not retreat when the lamps were lit, but grew bolder, closer, as if the walls themselves were feasting. In silence, attendants wondered what was truly being eaten, and whether the vermin scuttling in the shadows were only rats at all. By the autumn of 1886, the silence could no longer hold. Too many families had arrived at Northampton with parcels of clothing or baskets of food, only to be met with the same answer. Their loved one had died suddenly and been buried without ceremony. Too many letters had gone unanswered, too many graves proved unmarked, too many names crossed from ledgers without proof of where the bodies had gone. Mothers, fathers, and siblings began to gather their grievances into words that could not be dismissed as easily as whispers at the gate. Letters poured into the offices of the Massachusetts legislature, formal pleas demanding investigation into what they called The unaccountable mortality of the hospital. Some were written in stiff legal language, others in trembling script filled with grief, but all carried the same accusation. Northampton was losing its patients, and no one could explain why. In Boston, legislators grew uneasy. They had long boasted of their asylums as models of enlightened care, proof that Massachusetts stood at the forefront of moral progress. Yet here were dozens of families, scattered across the state, each insisting that their sons and daughters had vanished without proper record. To ignore them entirely risked scandal. To act decisively threatened to expose what lay behind the hospital's locked doors. The legislature responded with delays and half measures, sending committees who toured only the front parlors, interviewed only the most compliant patients, and departed satisfied that mismanagement, not malice, explained the discontent. Newspapers, cautious of offending state authorities, carried timid notices. The Springfield Republican published a brief column titled "Neglect at Northampton," describing overcrowding, spoiled food, and inadequate staffing. The Boston Journal hinted at irregularities in the recording of deaths, yet none dared to print the darker rumors that circulated among the families themselves, that the bodies had not been buried at all but consumed within the hospital walls. Editors knew too well the risk of defamation suits, and besides, the very suggestion of cannibalism seemed unfit for respectable print. Better to chalk the complaints up to grief-stricken imaginations than to publish what might unsettle the public's faith in the asylum system. Behind closed doors, however, families compared stories. A mother who had been told her daughter was buried in the hospital cemetery found no marker, only overgrown weeds. A brother who pressed for an autopsy report received nothing but silence. A father who demanded to see his son's remains was threatened with removal by guards. They began to suspect that neglect was too mild a word, that something more deliberate lay beneath. The letters they sent to Boston may not have spoken it aloud, but in their private gatherings the word rose again and again, whispered like a curse that no one wanted to believe but none could fully dismiss: cannibalism. The first real crack in Northampton's carefully polished facade came not from grieving families or timid reporters, but from within the hospital itself. In December of 1886, a letter arrived at the offices of the Boston Journal, unsigned and sealed with a plain wax stamp. It was addressed to the editor personally, and its contents were unlike anything he had ever read. The writer identified himself only as a physician employed at Northampton State Hospital, a man whose conscience had grown too heavy to bear the silence any longer. Only later, through scraps of correspondence and whispered recollections, would his name be attached to the letter: Dr. Edward McGrath, a young physician scarcely 30 years of age. McGrath wrote with the precision of a man trained in science, but his words carried the tremor of disgust. He described what he called experimental sustenance, a practice quietly sanctioned in the locked wards of the hospital. According to his account, patients were being sustained on human tissue rendered from the bodies of their fellows, under the justification that madmen will not know. He insisted it was no accident of neglect, but a deliberate program carried out under the authority of Ward C's overseer, Dr. Albert Fisk. Corpses that should have been buried were instead diverted to the kitchens, their flesh boiled down into stews and broths fed to the living. McGrath did not cloak his horror. He wrote of the first time he suspected the truth, when he recognized the unmistakable structure of a human joint floating in the ladle of a stew pot. He wrote of patients who grew suspicious, refusing to eat, only to be confined and silenced. He admitted that fear had bound his tongue for months, but the letters from families, the mounting whispers of missing kin, had driven him to risk exposure. "I cannot allow this to continue unspoken," he declared. "The public must know that their children, their siblings, their parents are not buried in soil, but consumed in secret." The editor of the Boston Journal hesitated. To print the letter in full risked ruin if it proved false. Instead, the paper published a cautious article hinting at unwholesome practices at Northampton, quoting unnamed sources who described experiments in nutrition that defied ethical boundaries. The article drew immediate outrage and dismissal in equal measure. Hospital officials branded it slander. Legislators called it hysteria. But among the families who had lost loved ones, the piece confirmed what they had long suspected. McGrath never attached his name publicly, and within a year his position at Northampton ended quietly. Some claimed he fled the state. Others whispered that he met with an accident on the road one winter's night. His fate remains uncertain, but the words he left behind linger still, a testimony too precise to dismiss, too ghastly to forget. It was in the stifling heat of July 1886 that Northampton's darkest night unfolded. The air inside Ward C was thick with the smell of boiled meat and sweat, the corridors heavy with the weight of bodies crammed together, restless and hungry. Supper had been delayed, tempers were high, and the patients muttered as the carts finally rolled in. Bowls were set before them, the same watery stew they had endured for months. But when one man, trembling with suspicion, tipped the ladle back and stirred, something surfaced that froze the ward into silence. Floating among the broth and gristle was a hand pale, bloated, the skin slipping from the bone, its nails unmistakably human. The man screamed, overturning the pot, the broth splashing across the floor as others shrieked in horror. The sight ignited a frenzy. Bowls were hurled, benches overturned, fists pounded against doors. The patients surged against their keepers, voices rising into one great howl. "They are feeding us the dead." For the first time, the whispers of suspicion were given terrible form, and the ward erupted into chaos. Guards stormed in with clubs, their boots pounding the floors, their shouts drowned by the cries of the inmates. The patients, maddened by fear and revulsion, fought back with whatever they could grasp: splinters of wood, shards of pottery, even their bare hands. It was not a coordinated rebellion but a convulsion of desperation, an attempt to reject what they had seen with their own eyes. In response, the guards turned brutal. Clubs cracked against skulls, ribs splintered beneath boots, and when the violence refused to subside, the order was given to unleash the cold water hoses. Freezing torrents blasted through the ward, knocking men and women from their feet, drenching them until they could no longer breathe. The water pooled across the floor, turning red where blood spilled from broken mouths and battered faces. Still, some clung to their rage, striking at the guards until they were beaten to the ground. By the end of the night, 7 patients lay dead, their bodies carried silently down the corridor, never to be seen again. Official reports described the incident as an outbreak of mania among the violently insane, suppressed with necessary force. No mention was made of the hand in the stew, nor of the 7 whose lives were extinguished beneath clubs and hoses. Families were told their kin had succumbed to exhaustion or fever. The newspapers printed nothing at all. Within a week, the incident had been buried, as carefully hidden as the bodies themselves. Yet among the survivors, the memory burned. They knew what they had tasted, what they had seen. The night of the riot proved what whispers could not. The dead had returned to their bowls, and no silence could erase the truth. In the spring of 1978, Northampton's long-abandoned asylum grounds were being surveyed for redevelopment. The state had closed the hospital to patients 5 years earlier, leaving behind the sprawling carcass of the institution. Red brick facades with shattered windows, iron doors rusting on their hinges, hallways echoing with nothing but wind. Plans called for new housing and office space, but before foundations could be laid, crews were ordered to clear the overgrown fields that stretched beyond the eastern wing. It was there, beneath soil long untouched, that the first pit was opened. At first, the workers assumed they had uncovered an old trash deposit. The earth was littered with fragments of bone, scraps of cloth, and shards of crockery. But as they dug deeper, the pattern became unmistakable. Skeletons lay jumbled together in shallow trenches, dozens of them, their bones pressed tight in ways that suggested hurried burial rather than careful interment. The smell of damp earth rose sharp and metallic, and when the bones were lifted into the light, the true horror revealed itself. Forensic examiners were called in, and their findings recorded quietly in the margins of state reports. These were not ordinary medical remains, not the bones of patients dissected for anatomy lessons or buried in dignity. The skeletons bore marks inconsistent with autopsy, but chillingly consistent with butchery. Long bones had been split lengthwise to extract marrow. Vertebrae carried the scoring of cleavers. Skulls showed signs of having been struck and cracked open. In some cases, cuts were so precise they suggested skilled hands, the kind of technique honed in kitchens or on battlefields rather than classrooms. The official explanation offered to the press was vague. The state admitted only that historic remains had been uncovered, possibly tied to the hospital's early years when burial practices were less standardized. The word butchery was never used, and no mention was made of the knife marks. The pits were hastily catalogued, the bones reburied in a municipal cemetery under a collective marker that spoke blandly of patience lost to time. But those who handled the remains whispered among themselves. These were not burials, they were disposals. The patients had not simply died, they had been processed, reduced, their bodies treated as material rather than human flesh. For the families who still carried unanswered questions, the discovery was both confirmation and condemnation. Here was evidence that the missing had never been laid to rest in graves, that the asylum had hidden its secrets beneath a thin skin of soil. The pits were mute, but the knife marks spoke louder than any testimony. Whatever Northampton had claimed to be, its earth revealed the truth. It had been a place where the dead were not honored but consumed, their bones buried in silence, waiting decades for shovels to bring them back into the light. When rumors at last began to seep beyond Northampton's walls, the state moved swiftly, not with open inquiry, but with silence carefully maintained. Officials in Boston knew the asylum system was fragile, its reputation already strained by tales of overcrowding and neglect. To allow the darker stories of Ward C to surface would risk not just scandal but the collapse of public faith in every institution across Massachusetts. And so, when complaints and letters could no longer be ignored, the decision was made behind closed doors. Dr. Albert Fisk would be removed, but not disgraced. The reassignment was presented as a natural transition, a man of long service stepping aside for reasons of health and age. Fisk was quietly granted a pension, his record expunged of controversy, his title preserved. No questions were asked in the legislature, no hearings called. 1 month he was superintendent of Ward C, the next he was gone, his name mentioned only in passing as someone who had retired to private life. The machinery of state bureaucracy closed ranks around him, ensuring that whatever knowledge he carried about Northampton's kitchens and ledgers would never be spoken in official circles. Under new leadership, the hospital continued its operations. The doors never shuttered, the wards never emptied. A fresh superintendent was installed, his task not reform but reassurance. Families who pressed for answers about their vanished kin were met with the same weary explanations: consumption, fever, sudden collapse in the night. Disease took your loved one, they were told, as it does in all institutions where the weak are gathered. Graves remained unmarked, autopsies absent, bodies unseen, but the language of medicine and inevitability smoothed over the raw edges of grief. Those who protested were accused of misunderstanding the nature of insanity, of letting their emotions cloud their reason. No mention was ever made of mutilation, of bones split and marrow drawn, of bodies rendered for use. These phrases belonged to whispers, to hidden ledgers, to rumors too monstrous for the public record. In reports to the legislature, Northampton was described in the bland vocabulary of bureaucracy: overcrowded but improving, underfunded but functional, a necessary burden borne by a compassionate state. The truth was buried as surely as the bodies in the shallow pits beyond the eastern wing. In this silence, the institution endured for more than a century, its reputation tarnished but intact, its secrets preserved by officials who valued order above truth. Families moved on, grief softened by time, and the world forgot what Northampton had consumed within its walls. Only the land itself remembered, and the echoes of what was never spoken lingered in the stone and soil, waiting for those willing to hear them. In the first years of the new century, when Northampton still operated under its cloak of respectability, two slim volumes began to circulate quietly among reformers and curious readers. They were memoirs, published by former patients who had survived their confinement long enough to tell their stories. At first glance, they seemed like the confessional works common at the time, tales of religious salvation or recovery from madness, but within their pages lurked details that unsettled even the most hardened skeptics. Though the authors had never met, their recollections aligned in ways too precise to dismiss. The first was written by a woman identified only as E.M., who had spent 3 years at Northampton after what her family described as melancholia. Her prose was halting, heavy with shame, yet her passages about the meals in Ward C carried a peculiar clarity. She described the stew as strange, not merely thin or rancid but flavored in a way that defied comparison. The meat was too sweet, she wrote, and clung to the teeth as if it wished to remain there. She recalled the nausea that followed each supper, the heaviness in her limbs, and the terrible dreams that came afterward, dreams of screaming voices rising through the walls each time smoke poured from the kitchen chimney. The second account came from a man, William H., whose confinement stemmed from what was then called nervous exhaustion. His memoir, published in a small Boston press in 1907, echoed the same details with unnerving precision. He too remembered the flavor of the food, its texture, unlike pork or beef, its sweetness lingering on the tongue. He wrote of nights when the chimney belched thick black smoke, carrying with it a smell both metallic and sweet, and how afterward the ward fell into restless silence. As though every patient was dreaming the same nightmare at once, William claimed he would wake in a sweat, convinced he heard voices calling from beneath the floors, begging not to be forgotten. Both memoirs were dismissed by critics as the inventions of disturbed minds, the unreliable tales of people who had once been deemed insane. Yet reformers who read between the lines noted the uncanny parallels. Two different patients, confined at different times, recalling the same taste, the same smoke, the same haunting dreams. Their words lent weight to the rumors families had whispered for decades that Northampton was not merely neglectful, but that it had consumed the very people entrusted to its care. The books soon fell out of print, lost among the tide of reform literature, but their testimonies lingered. Even as the hospital continued into the 20th century, their voices offered a fragile, haunting echo of the truth the state had buried. The dead were never gone, only fed back to the living, their cries seeping upward each time the chimney burned. By the close of the 19th century, long before Northampton State Hospital's decline and eventual closure, stories had already begun to take root in the soil around its sprawling grounds. Local families who lived within sight of the looming brick structure spoke in lowered voices of the odors that rolled down the hill on damp evenings. The official explanation was always the same: burning waste, spoiled food, or the smoke of laundry fires, but townsfolk called it something else. They called it the meat smoke. It carried on the air with a thickness that made the stomach turn, sweet and metallic, a smell that clung to clothing and hair long after one left the hill. Farmers claimed their animals grew restless when the smoke drifted across the fields, cattle lowing uneasily, dogs barking at nothing. Housewives swore they could taste it in their bread. Folklore crystallized quickly, especially among the young. Children in the town of Northampton would dare each other to creep up the asylum's long stone wall after sundown, to press an ear against the outer bricks of Ward C. Those who did returned pale and shaken, claiming they heard chewing slow, rhythmic gnawing that seemed to move just beyond the thickness of the wall. Some swore it was rats, others insisted it was something worse, the sound of patients feeding where no food should have been. To touch the wall was proof of courage, but also a mark of doom, A child who lingered too long risked hearing their own name whispered back through the cold mortar. Adults dismissed these stories as childish fancy, yet they too avoided the hill after dusk. Carters who drove their wagons along the nearby road told of shapes in the windows, faces pale as wax, watching them pass. Couples courting along the outer fence described an uncanny stillness, as though the air itself held its breath. On nights when the meat smoke thickened, no one lingered outside. Doors were barred, lamps turned low, prayers whispered over children tucked tightly into bed. Folklore grew bolder as the years passed. Some said that if you walked 3 times around the hospital at midnight, you would hear footsteps behind you, but if you turned, no one would be there. Others claimed the gardens yielded vegetables with roots twisted like human fingers. A few insisted that every crow in the county roosted on the asylum roof each winter, their caws mixing with the cries of the patients until no one could tell which was which. The asylum loomed not only as a place of treatment, but as a threshold between worlds, a place where smoke carried the taste of the dead and walls echoed with chewing that should never have been heard. To live in Northampton was to live in its shadow, where stories clung as stubbornly as the smell in the wind, and where children grew up knowing some doors, once opened, could never be shut. When Northampton State Hospital finally shut its doors in 1993, the end was quiet, almost perfunctory. For decades, reformers had called the sprawling complex obsolete, its cavernous wards too costly to maintain, its methods out of step with modern psychiatry. Politicians spoke of progress, of community care and new facilities, yet the closure carried the feel of a burial. Trucks hauled away furniture, cabinets, medical files. Shredders worked overtime. By winter, whole wings of the record archive were reduced to dust, the pages that might have revealed the darker truths of the asylum vanishing in a haze of paper confetti. What remained were official statements, sterile, polished phrases that spoke of efficiency and modernization, while sidestepping a century of whispered horrors. Journalists searching for former staff to comment met a wall of silence. Nurses, orderlies, even doctors who had once walked its halls declined interviews. Some offered polite refusals, citing confidentiality. Others hung up the phone without a word. A few, when pressed, betrayed flashes of something heavier than discretion. Eyes narrowing, voices faltering, memories pressing too close. It was as though the very act of speaking aloud what they had seen in Ward C would call it back into being. Silence was safer. The state declared the grounds unsafe, citing asbestos, collapsing ceilings, and structural instability. Fences rose around the property, warning signs nailed to rusting gates. But decay only heightened the building's magnetism. The young and curious, ghost hunters, amateur historians, and thrill-seekers alike found ways through the barriers. They carried flashlights and cameras, their footsteps echoing across long corridors where paint peeled like shedding skin. Some came away with photographs of nothing more than ruined plaster and rusted gurneys. Others emerged shaken, claiming they had heard sounds that did not belong to an empty ruin. Time and again, the accounts returned to the same refrain, the clatter of cutlery. Faint at first, like utensils rattling in a distant dining hall, though the cafeterias had long since collapsed. Then, layered beneath, the unmistakable sound of chewing. Not the frantic scrabble of rats, but slow, deliberate mastication, as though an invisible feast continued in the dark. Trespassers told of rooms where the air grew heavy with the scent of cooked meat, metallic and sweet. The same odor their grandparents once called meat smoke. Some swore they saw impressions at abandoned tables, indentations on dusty surfaces, as though plates had been set and removed only moments before. By the end of the decade, police patrols had increased, not only to keep out vandals but to quiet the stories. Still, Northampton lived on in whispers, its ruins echoing with the sounds no one wished to believe. Even in death, the asylum refused to starve.